Hello, and welcome to another Freethinker interview, and this time it's with Greta Christina. She's a blogger at gretachristina.com. She's also the author of 3 books, Why Are You Atheists So Angry? 99 Things That Piss Off the Godless, Coming Out Atheist, How to Do It, How to Help Each Other, and Why. And her newest book is Comforting Thoughts About Death That Have Nothing to Do About God. Hello.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on the show.
Yes, and the last time we spoke was actually around the same time last year because we did that series of interviews for the Yolanda fundraiser. And it's interesting, we're talking around the same time again, and there's another super typhoon that's hit the country. This time it's Hagupit, or Ruby as it's known in the Philippines. And it seems that death and disaster, of course, have a lot of relationship as far as religion goes. So, of course, one leads to the other. But beyond that, it's around this time when a lot of Filipinos really turn to religion. If you check out the RubyPH hashtag on Twitter, you'll see a lot of people mentioning prayer around this time. They're thanking God and Jesus for sparing the country because compared to Haiyan, this was a lot less damaging, and only 27 people died compared to the 6,340 of Haiyan. And of course, a lot of people are praying, a lot of people are thanking God, and they're basically just afraid of death. Mostly, it's that they're grieving right now for all those who were lost. But you tell us that we shouldn't concede the ground to death so easily, and that's what we're going to talk about. Your book and how even atheism or the secular outlook can provide some solace from things like death and disaster. So, first question: what motivated you to write this book?
Well, when I was first leaving my spiritual and religious beliefs, when I was first accepting that there was no God, there was no afterlife, there was no supernatural world, coping with death was one of the most difficult things that I had to deal with. And at the time, I didn't really know about the existence of a humanist community, a skeptical community. I wasn't familiar with humanist writings and philosophies about death. And so as a result, I kind of had to go it alone. I had to reinvent the wheel. I had to come up with my own ways of coping with mortality and death in a way that didn't involve any belief in the afterlife. And it was a fairly traumatic time for me. And I don't want anybody else to have to go through that alone. I think that, when people are leaving religion, or when they're questioning religion, or if they've already left religion, I want to be able to help them through and give them some ideas about some ways that we can deal with death without any kind of belief in a supernatural or an afterlife. And I do think that, a lot of people, religious believers and a lot of atheists, we tend to assume that religion has the death question won. That, boy, if religion were true, wouldn't that be awesome? Wouldn't it be great to believe in an afterlife, and so on? And so I think atheists and other non-believers, we tend to just not talk about death very much. And I think that's a mistake. I do actually think that humanist and atheist and skeptical views of death can be very comforting and can be very consoling in the face of our own mortality and in the face of grieving the death of people we love. I think in some ways it can be more comforting than religion. And so I want us to be talking about it so that people who are questioning religion aren't so afraid and know that this is something that, as difficult as it is, and as painful as it is, that it is something we can cope with.
Yes, you mentioned that you wanted to help people who have a more secular outlook during these very stressful times. And I can imagine just giving this book to someone who has gone through such an experience, especially during times like disaster or death or disease, and being able to cope with it better. And I can see the length of the book because it's on the short side of books. It's I think around half or a bit more of the length of your previous book. and they can read through it, spend the day and read it, and it can really, get them through those kinds of times. So was that a consideration for you, choosing the length of the book and being um, uh, as succinct in as few words, expressing these ideas?
I mean, honestly, that was kind of a happy accident. The reason that the book is so short is that the book was commissioned by Audible, the audiobook producer, and they came to me and said, "We want a mini book. We want a short book with your views, your atheist views about death." And so they actually gave me an upper word limit. Um, but I do think that there's advantages to a longer book. You know, my previous book, Coming Out Atheist, is fairly long because there's a lot of detail and there's like lots of, here's how to come out as an atheist if you're in this situation, if you're in that situation, here's how to talk to families and to people you work with, and here's how to do it if you're in the military, if you're clergy, and so on. And I think having that level of detail is useful. But I do think that having a book be succinct can make it seem a little bit more accessible. It can make it seem like, okay, this isn't a tome. I'm not like committing a week of my life to reading it. I can read this in an evening or an afternoon, and feel and still get the help from it. So it wasn't necessarily an idea that I didn't deliberately set out to make it a short book that was assigned to me. But I'm not sorry. I think it's not a bad idea.
But reading through the book, I mean, despite its length, it's pretty obvious that you've done a lot of thinking on the subject. You recount a lot of incidents that happened in your life that made you really reflect on the topic. So can you share with us those significant moments? You don't have to mention all of them, just some.
Sure. I mean, like I said, the incident that initially triggered me that initially triggered me letting go of my religion in the first place it wasn't a brush with death exactly. I had surgery. It was pretty minor surgery, but I had general anesthesia, and I had this experience of, I don't know if you've ever had general anesthesia, but when you're out, you're gone. It's not like being asleep where you kind of have this sense of having been around, you have this sense of time having passed. And with general anesthesia, I was just gone. And when I came out of it, I kind of realized, and I'd been questioning my beliefs anyway, but I kind of realized if just a little bit of a drug in my bloodstream can eradicate my consciousness that much, what on earth makes me think that my consciousness is going to survive being dead and my brain, actually rotting and turning into dust in the ground? Um, and that's so my letting go of religion was very much closely intertwined with my accepting mortality. And so for me, the experience of my atheism and the experience of accepting the finality of death, they were very much part of the same thing. And again, it was a traumatic experience for a while. And certainly, I was going to say I've thought about death, off and on my whole life, but I think we all have. Death is something that we all have to deal with. That doesn't particularly make me special. I did, though, have some experiences a couple of years ago that really made me think about death and mortality very closely. And that's that in October of 2012, my father died. And it was an expected death. He had been ill for a long time, but of course it's like it's never, even if it's not a surprise, it's still a surprise and it's still upsetting. And then literally less than 2 weeks later, I was diagnosed with cancer. And I'll jump to the end of that story for people who are worried. I'm okay. I had surgery. The cancer's gone. But having those two things happen at the same time for me, having, my father's death and then being confronted with my own mortality so close together really got me looking at death and mortality and grief much more closely. And the thing that kind of surprised me about that experience was I was kind of waiting when that happened. I was waiting for the moment when I wished I would believe in God and when I wished I would believe in heaven. And I didn't really expect that, all of a sudden I'm going to start believing just because it would be convenient to do so. Because I know all the arguments against religion much too well. I've been making them for years now. Um, But I kept expecting to want to believe, to wish to believe, and it didn't happen. Actually, what I found was that whenever I imagined believing in God, it didn't make me feel comforted. It made me really angry. I mean, it made me think, well, what kind of jerk would do that? What kind of jerk would kill somebody's father and then give her a cancer diagnosis 2 weeks later? Who does that? Um, and also, when I imagined if I believed in God, I think I would feel really guilty. I'd be worried about, like, what did I do wrong? Why is he punishing me? Did I do something bad? I trying to figure out what it was, trying to figure out what his motivations were for doing this terrible thing. I just kind of imagined tying myself up in these knots. Whereas with my humanist and my skeptical beliefs about death, I mean, yes, I have to accept that death is real and that it's final, but I don't have to tie myself up into knots thinking, wondering why, wondering who did this, sort of that whole idea that everything happens for a reason. I don't find that very comforting because a lot of terrible things that happen. And, you were talking before about the typhoon. Like, if I were in that situation, I would be like, well, why is this happening? I mean, it's not very comforting to me to think that God is making this happen on purpose. It's actually really upsetting. And, it's like, well, okay, yay, only 29 people died this time, but why did those 29 people have to die? Why did the thousands of people have to die the last time? Thinking of it as a mercy that this horrible thing happened and it wasn't as bad as it could have been. I don't find that very comforting. I think there's a lot of people who don't find that comforting. When you read the writings of religious believers, sometimes they say that their beliefs comfort them in the face of death, but sometimes they say the opposite. Sometimes they're really torn up by their beliefs and they're trying to reconcile them. And I found that when I was facing really one of the worst times in my life, that my humanist ideas and my skeptical ideas about death, they were very comforting because, for one thing, I knew they were real. I knew I wasn't lying to myself. I knew I wasn't making it up, and that it wasn't just wishful thinking. I knew that it was based on reality, and that felt good. That felt like it was a really solid foundation.
Believers, I know how they can tie themselves in knots trying to justify things like this. But one thing that they don't like to think about is death itself, to come to grips with it. And you mentioned in your book this study about how believers tend to cling to life more than non-believers do. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So again, there's sort of this idea, and a lot of atheists buy into this as well as believers. There's this idea that if you have religion, you can handle death more easily, that it's better, you're more comforted because you think it's not real, because you think it's just sort of a phase. But there's been some research done that shows, a couple of pieces of research. One shows that people who are intensely religious and who are using religion to manage their life and to manage their illness, when they're in the last week of their lives, they're actually more likely than people who are secular to get very intense interventions. When you're in the last week of your life and pretty much all hope is gone, you're going to die. Everybody knows you're going to die. Religious believers are more likely to still get more heroic measures, medical interventions, to try to prolong their life. And so that tells me that, well, it seems comforting on the surface, but when they're actually faced with death, when it's really staring them in the face, it's coming up right now. It's actually not very comforting, and they're very frightened of it. The other piece of research that religious believers, or very intense religious believers, are less likely to have prepared for death. They're less likely to have advanced medical directives, those, instructions saying this is what I want to have happen when I'm really sick. If I'm unconscious, this is, it's like, do this, do that. You can pull the plug at this point and not at that point. They're more likely to have wills, prepared. They're people who are secular are more likely to have prepared for death, and people who are much more religious are less likely to have these preparations in place. And again, that tells me that their belief isn't really a comfort because they don't want to think about death. And I don't know this for sure, but I kind of, based when you look at this research, it seems to me that what's happening is that religious belief is a comfort on this kind of superficial level, but they can't really think about it. They can't really contemplate the reality of death. They just, it's kind of an avoidance. Religion isn't really a death; it's a way of ignoring it. And if that's true, then when you really have to think about death, and it's like, think about, what do I want to have happen when I'm very sick? What do I want to have happen when I die? Um, Secular people are more willing to do that, and I think that to me that shows that secular ways of handling death, that we're actually handling it. We're not just ignoring it.
So aside from this inoculation from thinking about death, which I totally agree with, you also mentioned in the book that non-believers, because of their acceptance of death, tend to think about life differently as well. Because sort of death becomes a deadline, and that's one of my favorite parts of the book. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I do think that it's one of the reasons why I think it's important for non-believers to have books, to have support systems, to talk with each other about death and grief and mortality, because the ways that we deal with death are in many ways very different from the ways believers deal with it. I'm going to put in a plug here for, if people aren't familiar with it, there's an online support group called Grief Beyond Belief, and they're on Facebook and they have a website. And it's basically a support group for non-believers who are grieving. And the reason it exists, and there's a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons it exists is that secular ways of coping with death are often very different from religious ways. For instance, again, religious believers, sort of their way of coping with death is to pretend it doesn't exist. It's like, it's not real, I'm really just mortal, and everything's fine. Um, One of the ways that I deal with death is to see it as a deadline. It's, my life here is finite, and so that means I need to get going. I'm a very deadline-driven person. That my life is finite, that's what drives me to do the things that I want to do. It's what drives me to work hard. It's what drives me to really savor the pleasures of my life and really enjoy them and appreciate them. And it's what drives me to try to make the life better for other people. If other people are mortal too, if everybody on this planet is mortal, and a whole lot of people are born into just misery and despair, and they're born and their lives are terrible, and then they die, and that's it, that's not okay with me. And if I had religious beliefs, if I believed in an afterlife, I think I'd be more inclined to say, well, that's okay. Sure, people are born into misery and despair and poverty and racism and all these horrible things, but God's going to make it okay in the end, in the afterlife, and they'll be fine in heaven. Knowing that that's not true, that really drives me to try to make this world a better place for myself and for other people.
And aside from that very practical way of looking at things, how you can enjoy uh, life more and do more with this deadline, you also speak very poetically and very philosophically about how time and change is really the fabric of life. And to be part of that, you have to really accept that. And this is a very, spiritual way of looking at it, if I may. And do you think that with books like yours, and with Sam Harris' book on waking up, that there's this sort of trend for more secular writers to give their a very spiritual outlook to compete with what people are more used to, basically religion and all that, and new age. So this is a very secularly and even scientifically grounded philosophy. Do you think that that's a trend, and do you think that more secular writers should do the same?
Well, I tend to avoid the word spiritual. I don't call what I'm doing spiritual, just because I think the word is really confusing. I think that when we use the word spiritual, it kind of means two things, and then those meanings get confused and conflated. We use the word spiritual to mean a sense of wonder, a sense of awe, a sense of really deep connection with the universe, that sense of, sort of suddenly feeling really present in the world, a sense of transcending ordinary experience and so on. We also use the word spiritual to mean supernatural, to mean a belief in things, souls and angels and so on, things that aren't physical. And those meanings get confused, and I actually have seen this get used against atheists. Religious believers say, well, how can, it's like your life is so empty without a sense of spirituality. And they're kind of slipping back and forth. They're like being slippery about, do they mean by spirituality, do they mean, a belief in the supernatural, or do they mean just, again, that sense of connection, that sense of being part of something bigger than yourself. So I don't use the word spirituality. I do think that I think this has always been happening, and it's coming more to the forefront, and I'm glad that it's happening. I do think that a lot of non-believers are writing more about sort of what does it mean to be a non-believer, and not just the arguments against God and why God doesn't exist and religion is bad. And I think those are important. That's an important argument to have. But I think that we need to extend beyond that. We do need to talk about what does our life mean, and what is our place in the world? What is our place in the universe? And why are we here? Not in the sense of why did some being put us here, but what do we want to make of our lives? And I think people have been doing this for a long time, but I'm glad to see it coming to the forefront more.
Finally, you mention a disclaimer in the book. These ways of thinking about things, all of the philosophy, all of the arguments that you made for that, they're just a bridge. You use that metaphor, and that what's more important still is, and I quote you, you say the best comfort is still companionship and witness of other people. And of course, grief beyond belief you already mentioned. And can you tell us more about the importance of organizations like Grief Beyond Belief, and particularly how religious people, when they try to help, they inadvertently hurt, especially when it's non-believers that they're speaking to in these times of stress?
Sure. Well, so it is true, and it's, I think, one of the most important ideas in the book is that when we're offering comfort in the face of death, and in the face of our own mortality, or the face of the death of somebody we love, it's not like, our humanist and atheist and skeptical philosophies, they're not going to make grief disappear. They're not going to make the fear of death disappear. Of course, of course we're human. Of course we love the people that we love, and when they're gone, of course we're going to grieve. We should grieve. Life is wonderful, and I can't imagine who I would be if, like, the people I cared about most deeply, when they were gone, I'd just be la la la, everything's fine. Of course we grieve over them, and of course we fear our own death. We're descended from a long line, or hundreds of millions of years of animals who really, really wanted to live, and we want to live and value our lives and want it to continue. And so the ideas in this book, they're not meant to make fear and grief disappear. They're just meant to kind of help soften it a little bit. They're meant to give people a sense that once that immediate, horrible, just gripping fear and grief have passed a little bit, that they have a life that's meaningful, that they can return to. And that's certainly a lot of what it meant for me. I mean, I went through a terrible time when my father died. I went through a very terrible time, but I had this sort of foundation. And so even when I was going through the worst of it, I knew I had something solid to return to. And I do think that that's a lot of what we can offer each other is, and I wrote this book for people who want it and people who are seeking it out. But honestly, if somebody I know is grieving, if somebody I know is confronting their own mortality, I'm not going to sit there and philosophize at them. I'm just going to, basically what I'm going to say is, I am really sorry, that sucks, and what can I do to help? And I think that that's most of what, in a more personal sense, we can give to each other. And I think that we do that as individuals, with our friends, with our family members, and we do it as a community. We can do it, with, like I say, online support groups like Grief Beyond Belief, just online, or in your local community, if you're part of an atheist community, if you're going through, some grief or some fear about death. Just supporting each other in ways that aren't denying reality, and that just acknowledge, yes, grief is terrible, and it's really hard, and we're here to help, and we're here to just be there with you, and to sort of to be the life that you're going to return to when the worst of it has passed.
Greta, thank you very much for your time and for doing this interview. I really recommend the book, not only for people who are dealing with death, but who doesn't really have to deal with it eventually, right? But for people who just want to know what it's like to think as a secular individual, on life and on matters such as death, and even what makes life beautiful. I think it's really a book that should be celebrated, and it's a nice gift for Christmas. And a lot of people would need that kind of cheering up, especially in times like these. There are two more typhoons set to hit the Philippines, I hear, in this month alone. So thank you so much. And is there anything else that you want to add before we end this interview?
I just want to let people know the book is coming out December 11th. Right now, it's just coming out as an ebook and as an audiobook. There are plans to have it be in actual physical dead tree print form, but that's not going to be for a little while. So right now, it's just ebook and audiobook. It's called Comforting Thoughts About Death That Have Nothing to Do with God, and I hope that it can help some people get through some hard times.
Thank you very much.
No, you're so welcome. Thanks for having me on the show.